Thank you. Good morning. Welcome to House Government Operations and Military Affairs, Thursday, April 6th. We are taking up S17, an act relating to sheriff reforms. And opening things up, we have Senator Ruth Hardy from Senate Gov Ops, chair of that committee.
If you want to listen to this, go online.
Hi, Annie, you're not on mute. All right.
Hi to Jim.
We're zooming. Senator, how are you this morning?
I'm just fine. Thank you, Representative. It's nice to see everyone. Thank you. I'm Senator Ruth Hardy from the Addison District. Thanks for having me. The bill before you is S17 related to sheriff reforms. I know I don't have to tell at least the vice chair and the chair, and I'm assuming the committee, about all of the issues that we have had with sheriffs around the state. There have been multiple issues with multiple sheriffs in multiple jurisdictions, and very serious allegations and violations of conduct of law enforcement officers, and also ethical violations and concerns, and frankly, just dereliction of duties of sheriffs throughout the state. And I will emphasize, and I have emphasized all along, this is not all sheriffs. There are many very excellent sheriffs. There's one sitting in the room with us today. But this is beyond sort of few bad apples. This is a systemic issue with the office of the sheriff, and we tried to take a systemic approach to it. However, the thing that we sort of butted up against time and time again, and you will hear from our legislative council, is that we are limited in what we can do to put requirements for the office into statute because they are constitutional officers. And we are limited by what we can do as legislators to make requirements on other elected officials unless the Constitution explicitly gives us the authority to do so. And that is the case in some instances. And the Senate Government Operations Committee is exploring this further with a proposed constitutional amendment that's related to sheriffs and potentially to all county officers. Each county officer has a different sort of little language in the Constitution about what we can and cannot oversee. And so we're trying to make it more uniform. But that is another thing that I hope to be able to talk to you later about when we get that constitutional amendment out of the Senate. But for now, I'll talk to you about S17 and what we felt like we were able to do and some things that you might want to look into a little bit further. So if you look at the bill, Tim will walk you through all the details, so I won't go into the complete details, but the first section of the bill is about the category B conduct, which I know you're all very familiar with because you did two bills already that worked on that, and add some provisions to category B violations that are sort of speaking to some of the things that we've seen with the conduct of sheriffs. The second section is about audits. Sheriffs already have in statute audit requirements for their office, particularly for the time between sheriffs or when there's a transfer from one sheriff to the next sheriff during and after an election or during a campaign or when a sheriff says that they are not going to seek office again. We tried to tighten up that language and to respond to some specific situations that we're seeing out in the field. The language that we included in the bill was recommended by the auditors. So I definitely suggest you hear from Deputy Auditor Tim Ash because we worked with him on the language, and he can share with you some of the really concerning things that they found in their audits of sheriff's departments, including a sheriff who paid out over $400,000 in bonuses to himself and his staff last year. So it's pretty concerning, and that's one of the reasons that we added tightening up the audit provisions in the bill. There is a section on conflict of interest or appearance of conflict of interest, and this language came into the bill sort of later in the process as after we were trying to find ways to ensure that essentially sheriffs are acting ethically. There were some questions about this on the Senate floor. One thing I would recommend is exploring the potential. There was a suggestion that we just sort of fold sheriffs into the state code of ethics, which is the code of ethics that we passed 2 years ago in the legislature that all of us fall under, and that other state officials do. And it could be possible to just include sheriffs in that, and it might be cleaner than having a different processes for sheriff. We tried to model this after the state code of ethics and the process that's laid out. But I would just suggest to you might want to look in and have them in and really explore that more. And I've talked to Tim about that, so he's prepared for your, if you decide to do that. One of the big things that you'll find out as you explore how sheriffs are funded and how they function is that they do almost all of their work through contracts. The sheriff themselves is a state funded employee. There's a base salary for sheriffs that is in the state statutes, just like the salary for commissioners and secretaries and the governor and other state executives they're listed in statute. The sheriff's salary for this session or for this year is, I believe, about $94,400. So not an insignificant salary, but sheriffs have in statute currently the provision of the ability to charge an extra 5% on top of all of their contracts and to use that 5% for whatever they want. Basically, as I see it, it's kind of a little sheriff's slush fund. And sheriffs use it for a variety of things. Some sheriffs use all of it and plow it back in their department to buy equipment, to pay for cars, to uniforms, training, benefits for their employees. And they use it for all the, reinvesting into the sheriff's department in a really productive way. Some sheriffs use it for providing themselves with pretty significant bonuses. The auditor's department, auditor's office, there was a question on the Senate floor about the bonuses and sort of how much they are. And we got some data from the auditor's office from last year. And I encourage you to talk with them and get this information from them about the level of bonuses that sheriffs are providing for themselves. Some are providing none. They're not taking any bonuses. And last year, the highest bonus a sheriff provided to themselves was $130,000 on top of their $94,000 salary.
Them as an individual.
Yes.
Not another party themselves. Okay.
Yeah. So some of them are just a couple $1,000s or nothing. And some of them it's pretty significant, over $40,000. So I would definitely suggest you talk to the auditor's department and look at that. Because there was an amendment at the end from our appropriations committee and sort of looking at how that amendment interacts with that data from the auditor's office. I think it would be helpful. But what we did was to say that fund, those funds, the 5% funds, could only be used for essentially the list of things that we got from the sheriff's department, the sheriff's association that were most necessary, including vehicles, uniforms, equipment, training, and professional services. The appropriations amendment did add that they could use it for a 2-year window for bonuses with some restrictions on it. But again, I encourage you to look at that and talk with the auditor and the data from the auditor's office about that. The other thing that has come up over the years is security for courthouses. One of the duties that many sheriff's departments use one of their duties is to provide security for our courthouses. And many of you have heard in your own districts about how that has been a problem, particularly during the pandemic, with staffing issues in sheriff's departments that has made it really difficult for them to provide coverage for all of the courthouses. But it's really strapped the judiciary because they can't open courthouses if they don't have appropriate security, because they are an area where there are concerns about security, obviously, because of what's happening in courthouses. So the judiciary and the Sheriff's Association work together to negotiate language about a statewide contract for courthouse security. And this was an interesting issue because originally we didn't have language in the bill about a statewide contract because the Legislative Council felt like the legislature couldn't tell the judiciary that they had to have a statewide contract. Well, it just so happens that I had the opportunity to speak on the record with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he said, oh, actually, Senator Hardy, we would love for you to tell us to do this. We want a statewide contract. And then the Chief Superior Judge came in and confirmed that as well. So we have in here language about a statewide contract. The two parties negotiated some terms about that contract, which were originally in the bill. Our Appropriations Committee took out the terms and said, that's really something they should negotiate. It shouldn't be in statute. But there is still a thing about statewide contract for courthouses, and that sheriffs would be required to provide it and the judiciary would be required to be part of that contract. And hopefully that's a win-win situation, that we will actually have the security that our courthouses need to move forward. So we did add some duties, and we were limited, as I said, in what we could do about qualifications and duties because of the Constitution. And there were proposals from both the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs and the Sheriffs Association themselves and others about things we could add, and we hit the wall of you can't do that under the Constitution. So just want you to know that was why there's it's fairly limited. We put in a requirement about a work schedule that would have to be public. And this is, these are the days I'm working. These are the days I've taken off. These are the days I'm working remotely. Kind of a basic schedule to provide some transparency for the days working, just like everybody knows when we're in session. Everybody knows if we're here for a vote. The governor keeps a calendar, mayors keep calendars. So it's a pretty standard thing. And this is in reaction to one of the situations of the Bennington sheriff who was out of state for a significant number of months, in fact, and wasn't able to provide proof that he was in the state doing his work. We talked a lot with the Department of Sheriffs and State's Attorneys and Sheriffs and the Sheriffs Association about standard operating procedures, manuals, and policies. And there are policies, there are operating procedures, but they're not collected in one place in a way that is easy for sheriffs to understand where they all are and that they have to comply by them. So we put in some language about creating that policy manual, that procedures manual, and making sure that sheriffs are required to follow it. We took testimony, the Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence came to us about an issue related to relief from abuse orders. And after a relief from abuse order, sometimes the victim needs to go to collect belongings, or the perpetrator might need to go collect belongings from a house to make sure that the two of them are no longer in the same place, and they need to collect their belongings. And often that requires law enforcement to go with them in order to make sure that there's not a bad situation. It turns out that some sheriffs were charging victims for these services. And so we put in that they are not allowed to charge. This one was a difficult issue. You will hear some testimony about it. But ultimately what our committee decided was that we don't want victims charged for this service. Municipal police officers don't charge for it, state police don't charge for it, and we don't think sheriffs should charge for it. And that the most important thing is that somebody who has a relief from abuse order be safe and have their belongings. The next couple sections is getting rid of some really old language about use of force and penalties for refusing to assist a sheriff. Nobody disputed that. It was very old language. And then the final thing is creating a task force to create a report, because we love reports and report backs and studies and all those things. So there's a list of members. I'm sure, like we always do, you'll hear people who want to be on it or off it. So, you can take that. And then a list of things that we wanted to hear back on. One is the financing of the compensation structure and the sort of financial structure of sheriff's departments. A huge barrier, not just the Constitution, but the way that sheriff's offices are funded and structured is a big barrier to creating accountability. And it's a barrier to them, for them. And, while we may disagree on the details, I think everyone, including the sheriffs themselves, felt like the contracting structure and the way that they're funded and the way that they're compensated is a barrier to providing good public safety and public service. So this study is partly to try to get at those issues. And there was a proposal from the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs themselves. And I know Annie's listening because we heard her. They proposed to us a restructuring of that department that would have provided sort of separate oversight of state's attorneys and sheriffs. And we had it all drafted and we're going to put it in the bill. And then they said, oh, actually, we're not sure that's going to work. So we took it out of the bill. So what's in here is a language about, hey, can we or should we restructure that department and would that be better? So you can see the things in the oversight: compensation, duties, efficiency and equity in delivering public safety services, maintaining policies and best practices, sustainable funding, the reorganization. And then there was one other thing that was added by our appropriations committee at the end. And now I can't remember it, but you'll see it in the final bill. And then that's a report back to us next year. So if we want to take further action in the second year of the biennium, we can, in addition to considering a constitutional amendment. So that is the bill. It's actually fairly detailed. So sorry, Tim, I didn't leave you as much to do.
No, that was great context. Any questions from any of the committee? Senator Hardy? Representative Hagley?
Vice Chair.
It's yours, sir.
So, Senator, I noticed that, again, I know we're kind of always like to have studies. And our PCB issue just recently brought that to light for me, that we had all this money in there and now we're holding up the money and having a study. So I'm wondering why, first of all, why the studies after the fact of a lot of this, and in particular, it talks about that study will come back on the 15th of November. That will be, there'll be a report to House Government Operations and Senate when we aren't in session. So how's that going to work?
Well, two things. One is, or a few things. One is we felt that the situation with sheriffs is serious enough. We've had serious issues with sheriffs: sexual assault, domestic violence, financial mismanagement, dereliction of duties across the state, that we could not wait to do some reforms this session. It has to be done. This is a systemic problem with sheriff's departments. And so waiting for a study to do some pretty basic stuff is irresponsible of the legislature. So we wanted to act this session with what we could do. And so that's what you see before you. And I think this committee can even probably come up with some other things that could be done this session. The study is really to build on what we're doing this session. And I will say that the financial stuff in here, the auditing stuff, that is coming from audits. The sheriff's departments are all audited. And the auditor's office found some significant issues in the audits with sheriff's departments. And so that's already a study. An audit is a study. And they contract out for those audits. Those are audits that are done by a contract auditing firm. And I encourage you to hear more testimony on that. So that study has already been done on the financial stuff. And then the testimony on every item in here is solid and sound, and none of the things that we have in this bill would require study prior to taking action. The study is supposed to build on the things that we are doing on this bill. And in terms of the November 15th report back, as returning legislators know, our second year of the biennium, we have an earlier deadline for putting in bills. And so if there are things in the study that require action, I'm certain that the chair of this committee and I will look at those together and determine whether or not this committee or members here or in my side putting together a bill to take further action so that we don't miss the deadline. And there would be further testimony and look once the legislature returns. But if we wait until after we're in session, we will have potentially missed the deadline for putting a bill in. So that's the timing.
Senator, speaking of timing, when do we anticipate that constitutional?
So we are continuing, we're actually taking up this afternoon, as you know, because you were here for the last constitutional amendments.
Yeah.
It has to first pass in the Senate, and then it comes to the House, and it would pass in the House. After it leaves the Senate the first time, it can't be changed. It can't be amended. The House doesn't get a chance to amend it. So we really want to make sure that the language is solid. So we're taking our time with that, and it didn't need to make crossover. It doesn't have the same rules. So we hope to have it passed out of the Senate this year, and probably the House would take it up next year. And then it has to go back again through a new legislature in the next biennium.
And so S-17 is something of a prerequisite to that?
I think S-17 is our first, attempt at trying to address some of the more immediate issues that we're able to do statutorily. It's not unlike the approach that we took to reproductive liberty. We did what we could in the statutes, and then we followed it up with a constitutional amendment. So it's really, we felt that the issue was serious enough and needed immediate attention, and then intermediate attention, and then longer term attention.
Great.
Yeah, thank you. And just so you know, a vote in our committee was 5-1. And we had a roll call on the floor, which I believe was 24-6. And I can confirm that. And we heard from a lot of witnesses, which obviously a lot of sheriffs, the Sheriff's Association, and then some individual sheriffs, the auditor's office, the Criminal Justice Council, the sheriff, state's attorneys and sheriff's department, the judiciary, Terry Corsones and Judge Zone, a few concerned citizens, lots of sheriffs, the County Judges Association, Crime Victim Services, the network, a high bailiff, a former senator, the League of Cities and Towns. So I'm happy. Well, you can get our witness list. So.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for the work on this. I think we all know how vital this is. A couple of things I wanted to point out. And we may get this later too, but funding for sheriffs right now is limited to sheriff's salary and one deputy. State funding.
The transport deputies are paid for by the state,
and one for each.
I actually don't remember. There may be one for each, but that was a change we made recently, last biennium, changing those to state employees. And then the sheriffs themselves are paid for through the state. And then there's some county funding that goes to sheriff's offices and then, or sheriff's departments. And then most of their funding comes through contracts. So, what we found was that it's sort of an odd incentive to, get more contracts. And some of those contracts are absolutely for public safety and law enforcement in some small towns, rural towns that don't have their own law enforcement, don't have their own municipal police. And some of them are for sort of security detail for private things and all sorts of different things.
So one of the charges of this committee will be funding? Was there any talk about the state taking over funding for the sheriff?
I think that's probably an option. It's always dicey to do that kind of thing. But I think that that's what this committee is supposed to look into is, looking at the funding structure. Right now, we heard from a number of witnesses that it's sort of, the structure is kind of policing for hire kind of structure. You can hire the sheriffs to be your police department if you don't have one, or to be your temporary police if for an event or something. And that creates some interesting incentives. And I think that committee, which the sheriffs themselves are on, by the way, and I don't think they like their funding structure either, although you can hear directly from them about it. I think looking at it and trying to figure out a better way of structuring the funding of sheriffs, and also are they providing the services that our communities need and want, and are they doing it in a way that is helpful and equitable and fair and just, and effective and efficient. We have a limited amount of funding to put toward municipal and county and state services. And so it doesn't make sense the way we're doing it.
I know in our rural county that the sheriff, a lot of towns really depend on the sheriff. Yeah. And if they're continually scratching for contracts, and I also want to say about that, I know as someone who's written a lot of grants and a lot of institutions like UVM, that administrative indirect costs are a big part of that. And so I want to take a look at that piece here. The other thing I wanted to mention though is there was suggestions from the Sheriff's Association and that was pulled out.
No, some of the language in here was suggested by them, and some of the issues, and then some of it some suggestions they made, we were not able to do because of constitutional issues. Requirements for the office of sheriff is something that is difficult to put in statute because of the Constitution. And some of it we just didn't think would get to the issue. So you'll hear from them. They were at the table the entire time in our room, every single time we took up this bill. So the other thing I would just want to note is there is no other there's no other state official that has the authority in statute to just give themselves a bonus. That is not the way it works. Somebody said to me, well, can't the governor just give himself a bonus? And I said, no, he can't just give himself a bonus. None of the other officers in state government can do that. So it's the only one.
And I agree. I think we need to look at that.
Yeah.
But I also know having this sheriff for us, that Mark is our sheriff in Windham County, you know where the money goes, and it goes back into this. So
absolutely.
But there's guardrails up, I think, otherwise, but I don't want to hurt the guys that are doing it.
Absolutely. And we tried really hard not to do that, and to make sure that it was clear that, there are many sheriffs that are doing a really good job, but there are many that aren't, and we just have to fix the system. And it can't be about individuals. It needs to be about the system. And that's important to remember.
I just want
I'm sure he'll be right there the whole time.
Yeah.
Representative Hooper and then Representative Morgan.
Good morning.
Good morning.
In your seeking testimony, particularly with regard to the financing of a sheriff's department, did you take testimony or reach a conclusion about what state or locality might be doing a better system that we might consider patterning after? There are a lot of states that the sheriff's department is primary.
Yeah, so the states most states have a much more significant county government than Vermont does. And they have a much more sophisticated county executive that oversees county government. And we don't. We have assistant judges who have both a judicial function and an executive function. And we have very little transparency in our county government finances. There's actually a county budget and a county tax rate, but it's pretty nobody really knows about how county government works here. And, we did consider digging into county government more broadly, but we tried to keep this focused on sheriffs. So most states that have sophisticated sheriff's departments have sophisticated county government that they are a part of. We just don't have that. So that sort of oversight and structure and support and funding and administration of sheriff's departments and most other states that have sheriffs are sort of based on the county government model. And unless we decided to create a sophisticated county government, which would take a lot of time and probably not something we're going to do, it's sort of an apples to oranges comparison. And then there are some states, frankly, that have just gotten rid of their sheriffs. Connecticut, is a good example, because they're a small state, New England state, that has state police and municipal police, and they didn't think they needed sheriffs anymore. So they actually just got rid of sheriffs. So it kind of, there's, different ends of that spectrum. I think that we found that there are services that our sheriff's departments are providing, particularly in rural areas of our state, that are really important and necessary. So there's, how do we balance that sort of oversight and accountability with the provision of really necessary public safety services?
Representative Morgan.
So first a comment, then a question, and the question may not even be directly for you, Senator, but somebody maybe in the room or somebody online. But the first comment I have is, I come from a district that they absolutely have to have the sheriffs. Grand Isle County has none of their 5 towns have a police force. They have to have them. State police can sometimes be an hour, 2 hours, depending on other stressors and strains they might have. We have to have a sheriff's department, absolutely. And Ray Allen and his folks do a stellar job with the resources they have. They've been constrained with finding manpower, especially during COVID. But that's, we could expand on that some other time. The other thing is, and again, maybe not a question for you, but maybe somebody online knows, but I'm kind of like a Paul Harvey, the rest of the story, and I'm not saying anybody's telling a yarn, but the $400,000 bonus that's in the Caledonia County Sheriff's Department, I would hope there's some justification or something that's rational other than that they just flung out $400K of money. And I'm not saying you're saying that, Senator, but that's an awful lot of money. I would hope there's something out there, some rationale behind it that we could go, oh, that makes sense, or no, that's horrid and that makes no sense. I mean, I don't know if the two extremes, or maybe it's in the middle. I don't know.
Well, I can tell you, you should hear from the auditor's office. That sheriff is no longer in office. He retired. So we didn't hear from him directly, but we heard from the auditor's office. And those bonuses were legal under the 5%. So nobody's alleged that person broke any law, but are they ethical and are they a good use of public funds? That's the thing. They were not only bonuses, they paid for the person's taxes for those bonuses as well, and also put money toward retirement for a bunch of people. So, I mean, I think everybody has different thresholds for what they think is appropriate. To us, it was a big red flag that's a lot of money to put toward bonuses, and to do a bonus saying, okay, we're going to pay for the bonus and we're going to pay for the taxes that come with those bonuses as well, was also a little concerning. But I encourage you to hear from the auditors.
Yeah, no, that'd be great, because it's just such a great sum of money. I would hope that there's something that would give some credence to what some method to the madness.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the things is that the sheriff's department feels like their salaries are insufficient, and that their retirement contributions are insufficient. And so that this was a means to make up for the insufficiency of the salaries and the retirement bonuses. Okay. So that's what I think is, and maybe it is, but I think there needs to be rules and parameters and guidelines around the provision of those kinds of salary supplements. And right now there aren't solid ones.
Sure. No,
there are for some departments. Some departments have those and they follow their rules strictly. And then some departments don't. So having sort of statewide consistent policies, and that's what we tried to get at with the policy and procedures manual, that does exist in some form, but isn't uniformly followed and isn't maybe as complete as it should be.
Sure. And I'll ask the other
Yeah.
fires on that same thing, just to get their understanding on it. That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think the folks from the department may be able to weigh in on that a little bit. Representative Hooper.
What year, Senator, if you know the answer, did Connecticut about?
I don't actually know that answer. We didn't take testimony from them directly, but just in,
And do you think that Vermont should consider, or do you think it's important to keep sheriffs in Vermont? Or do you, is that?
I think that I think it's important that we provide the services that especially our rural communities need for law enforcement. I mean, we just heard from, the member from Grand Isle that there are areas in the state that don't have public safety and law enforcement services, and we need to find a way to do that. Sheriffs is one way to do it. There are other ways to do it. And so I think the broader conversation of how do we meet the needs of every community in our state in terms of their public safety, law enforcement, and, public service, I think is really important conversation to have. Sheriffs may well be the best way to do it. I think there are other options too. I think that the question of do we need 14 sheriffs is certainly a question. There are vital services that sheriffs provide that we need them to provide, like security at courthouses. That's one of the reasons why we require this in the bill, is that that is a fundamental function of public safety for our court system to be able to function. And there were times when our courts couldn't function because sheriffs weren't there. That can be provided in another way, so I think that those are, but the courts want to have a certified law enforcement providing that security because it's helpful in many, many cases, that it's not just a private security firm of somebody who's not an actual certified law enforcement officer. So I think the answer to your question is not as simple as yes or no. I think we need to really look at what our communities need, and then how do we provide those services that they need? And in some cases, it could be through sheriffs, and in some cases, it could be through another means. But I wouldn't want to answer that question before we answer the underlying questions about need.
Got a lot of hands up, Representative.
It's a fun conversation.
Go ahead.
So I'm just wondering, talking about it being a systemic issue, and what have any reforms been tried up until now, or is this the first time? And then my other question is, if all the departments are audited, I'm not sure if I understand if this has happened before. Has someone looked at all the audits together to identify some of the root causes, and what were they?
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage you definitely to talk to the auditor's office, but auditor's office. The answer to your first question of have there been reforms in the past? There have been, particularly around the audit issue. There was an issue, and the sheriff in the room has the whole story on this, but there was an issue in one of our sheriff's departments about financial sort of mismanagement about 10-ish years ago. And that led to the statutory requirements about audits that are in the statute. So they've been in over 10 years, I believe. So that was one recent reform. So those the audits, yes, the auditor's office looks at all of those audits together, and the language that's in this bill in S-17 was recommended by the auditor's office after looking at the whole set of audits and saying, here are some of the issues we identified. These are some things we need to put in statute. One of the issues, some of them are one-off issues and some of them are systemic issues. So for example, the auditor recommended language about one sheriff whom Representative Byrong and I know created a little side nonprofit organization that had the exact same duties and function as the sheriff's department, and raised money, tax exempt money, in order to supplement the budget of the sheriff's department. And that seemed a little sketchy to the auditor's office. So we put language in about that. We can't tell sheriffs they can't create nonprofit organizations because there may be good reasons to. You know, it could be a labor organization. It could be, the sheriff's office baseball team or something. There could be reasons that they do it. So we can prohibit them from doing it. But the auditor's office said, at the very least, we should be notified that they're doing this so that we can check into it and make sure it's a legitimate purpose. And you can't create sort of a shadow nonprofit organization to supplement your own office. So there were things like that were concerning, but then just sort of looking, one of the big points of contention is the transfer when there's a sheriff who's retiring or not running again, or is defeated and there's a new sheriff coming in. And we saw that in Orange County, and the tension between when the old sheriff is leaving and the new sheriff is coming in, and that sort of period of 3 months, because election day is in early November. Sheriffs are sworn into office on February 1st. So there's like 3 months of time when things can happen with the finances that we really want to make sure there's eyes on those. And that's why there's a double signature happening during that time. So yes, there's a sort of holistic look at the audits. And in the 1970s, the mid 1970s, there was a sheriff that was brought forward for impeachment at the time. The only way sheriffs can be removed from office is through impeachment, just like other elected officials. And as you probably know, the impeachment process is not easy. That one didn't fully go through the impeachment process, but there were major changes to the state constitution in 1974 as well, a sort of like revamp of the judicial system in our constitution in 1974. And we're actually digging into the state archives to really to find out the reasons for that revamping of the state constitution that touched on sheriffs, but really looked more broadly at law enforcement and the judiciary and made changes. It's super fascinating to listen to to read the minutes from the judiciary committees in the late 1960s talking about these issues and why and how they wanted to change the Constitution. And so we are really digging into that and thinking, wow, in 50 years, maybe somebody will be listening to this tape right now and wondering what they're talking about.
ChatGPT doing it.
So I have Representative Chase and then Representative Higgins.
Connecticut did their thing 23 years ago.
There you go. Thanks for Googling
I
that.
have some experience with it. Maybe we'll all do some research on that. Representative Higley.
Yeah, this is just a statement following Representative Maricki and Morgan's. I've got to give kudos to my two sheriffs, Orleans County and Lamoille County. So I'm certainly going to be looking at this through a lens of, is this going to, better allow them to better serve their, constituency in the community or not, or is it going to hinder that? So that's the lens that I'm going to be looking at it through.
So I've got a couple of questions on it. I want to apologize for not being here for the first few minutes of
Totally
your
fine.
presentation. I was in another Senate committee with another one of our bills testifying. So apologies for that. Thank you for being here, Senator Hardy. Thank you for your work on this bill. My county and several of the other members' counties have either had a current public concern about the organization and professionalism of the sheriff's office. And at the same time, I hear the anxiety in our committee about how important the role of sheriff is and the duties that many of our sheriffs across the state perform admirably and well and honorably. So I want to just ask you if the real problem we have is that the office of sheriff right now is almost entirely dependent on the character of the individual who's elected.
I think that's part of the problem. I think that there's I definitely think the funding structure of our sheriff's departments leads to sort of perverse incentives to, chase the contracts, some of which are fully public service and public safety oriented and some of which aren't. But in order to fund themselves, they have to get more and more contracts. And so I think that creates this perverse incentive for them to do things that maybe aren't necessarily focused fully on public safety and public service. I do think there's a lack of accountability and oversight because we don't have a strong county government structure. There's really nobody else looking over their work. And because we are not able to put any kind of requirements for who can seek the office of sheriff and what their qualifications are, that can lead to people who are not necessarily serving with high integrity. And so I think we need to look at all of those. And it's difficult to remove a sheriff. The only way you can do it is through impeachment. And if we're not in session, then that creates a problem. And if we are in session, it sucks a lot of our time from our other important work. So I think there are a number of factors that are involved in that. And we tried to get at several of them in this bill, and then hopefully we'll get at more of them as the process continues. So it's not really a simple answer. And I think it's really important to understand that these are law enforcement officers who have a lot of power in our communities, particularly in our communities where there aren't other law enforcement. They are the only thing there. And they have the power to arrest people. They have the power to take people into custody, to put people in handcuffs, they have a gun. These are people with power. And we want to make sure that, people with the power to take away somebody's freedom is acting with the highest integrity and the highest level of accountability possible. Because their power and their duties are much more possible to infringe on the rights and freedoms of Vermonters than other elected officials like us that are part of a larger body and you can't arrest people. So I think it's really important to understand the context of what their duties are versus other. And they're executives, they run their whole department, and they have other people underneath them. They're responsible for all of the deputies underneath them legally and technically. They are responsible for the behavior of their own deputies. They have to actually put forth a bond that says that they are, covering for the duties, the behavior of their deputies. And we've seen deputies misbehave as well. One was just, there was a headline just the other day about, attempted murder charges being brought against a deputy sheriff. So there are other things brought more broadly as well.
Any other questions for Senator Hardy? Thank you for spending all of this time with us this
You're
morning.
welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking this up, and good luck, and let me know if I can be of further assistance.
Sure, we will be in touch.
Yeah. Take care.
Thank you.
So at this point, I'd like to have Tim come up and walk us through what's in the bill. It's nice to have you back. We've been in charter business for most of the last week or so. I haven't seen you much.
Very nice to be back. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And for you have, actually online, you will have the bill as passed by the Senate, in addition to a updated bill overview I've created. And if it's all right with the chair, perhaps I'll start with going through the overview, and we can jump into a line-by-line analysis, whenever you'd like.
yeah, I think starting with the overview would be great.
Okay. So this is S17, an act relating to sheriff's reform. The first part of the bill pertains to unprofessional conduct of law enforcement officers reviewable by the Vermont Criminal Justice Council. Section 1 will amend Title 20 VSA, Section 2401, which is titled Definitions. The statute pertaining to the conduct violations that may result in a law enforcement officer losing their certification to perform law enforcement functions. It adds 2 new categories to Category B conduct, specifically H and I, gross negligence for willful misconduct in the performance of duties, and abuse of power granted through the law enforcement officer certification. For reference, again, and this should sound pretty familiar to you folks, I imagine by this point, Category B namely entails gross professional misconduct and willful failure to comply with state required policy. And I just put a note in here flagging for the committee that this is the same section of law that will be amended by H 476, which is the bill pertaining to the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Commission recommendations. And actually, Section 3 of that bill adds 2 items in Category B conduct, also in H and an I. So if both were to advance, we can kind of rectify those letters.
Representative Hooper.
Sort of a weird question.
Sure.
I expect. If I got elected sheriff tomorrow, would I automatically become effectively a certified law enforcement officer, or would I just be the administrator of the office?
The latter. You'd have to go through the same procedures that anybody else seeking certification would have to go through.
I think that's a great question. And in our first pass through this bill and our initial conversations with some of the folks from the Sheriff's Association and the department, et cetera, I'd like the committee to start to get an understanding of the structure. You know, we touched on that a little bit in some of our early overview testimony in the beginning of the session. But there are going to be a lot of these kind of structural questions about how we do law enforcement oversight and accountability. And I really want the committee to ask those questions so that we can all get a good understanding of how these different pieces play. But I think we have a good amount of familiarity to Tim's point over this section because we did so much work as we looked at H 476 and H 482 in this area of, you know, professional conduct and the role of the Vermont Criminal Justice Council. Representative Higley.
Yeah, if we're good on this first part, Tim, you know, it talks about, it adds 2 new categories to Category B, an H and an I, which I'm surprised aren't currently there. But then go back down to what H 476 does, adding H and I. I mean, is that correct? Or should it be J and K? I mean.
Our office doesn't make really assumptions on which bills will be successful, so we just treat each one independently. And so if a bill drafting request comes in, wanting to add to a certain area of statute, we'll just insert wherever it is with no consideration at that moment whether there's other competing bills that would modify that.
So if both are passed, then it might have to be.
Yes. Yep, absolutely.
I had asked that question offline, and I was assured by both Tim and other members of Legislative Council that this kind of harmonization when bills are touching on the same area of law happens occasionally, and that we're not undoing work we did just because we're adding things to the same section.
Thank you.
The next part of the bill pertains to audits. This is sections 2 and 3. Section 2 amends Title 24 VSA 290, which is titled County Sheriff's Department. And this will add certain circumstances of a sheriff exiting office as triggering provisions regarding financial disbursements and transfer of assets to be co-signed by the sheriff and assistant judges. I'm happy to read through that language if the chair would like, or we can kind of continue. Very much generalizing. That's why I paused.
Yeah, we can come back to that with line by line. If I'm understanding correctly, we're just talking about putting a finer point and adding a bit to when the dual signature requirement is in the audits, that sort of interim period starts.
That's correct.
Yeah, we should look at the details of that, but I think for the overview phase, that's probably sufficient.
Section 3 will amend Title 24 VSA, Section 290B, titled Audits, to require that sheriff's departments cover the cost of audits. It will also require sheriff's departments to inform the auditor if a sheriff or deputy establishes a non-public organization of which the sheriff or any employee of the sheriff is director, and if that organization has a mission or purpose of supplementing the efforts of a sheriff's department. The organization's activities must be subsequently reported to the auditor as well. Pause there. Right. The next part of the bill pertains to conflicts of interest, and this is in Section 4. This will add Title 24 VSA, a new Section 314 to create conflict of interest requirements for sheriffs and deputies. In brief, a conflict of interest is defined as an interest that is in conflict with the proper discharge of the official duties due to a significant personal or financial interest. Sheriffs and deputy sheriffs are to recuse themselves from any matter where there is an appearance of a conflict or an actual conflict, unless the sheriff's executive committee approves the conflict. The Department of State's attorneys and sheriffs will establish procedures for handling ethics complaints from any source based on the procedure set forth in 3 VSA Section 1223, which is part of the existing State Code of Ethics in Title 3, Chapter 3. I'll pause there.
Go ahead.
No, just, so is this the place that we could possibly just include our current ethics revisions?
I was going to ask, similarly to that point, are executive judicial officers like sheriff, do they fall under the ethics commission's rules? I mean, how does...
Right now, and I can pull I can put together the definitions of who actually falls in the state ethics code, but it is members of the judiciary, attorneys, state employees, elected officials for state office, but not county office, and not municipal employees. So it doesn't really cover county debt as far as we understand it.
Do we run into any of the same constitutional questions that Senator Hardy referenced around, our ability as the General Assembly to put in qualifications for the office or to regulate the office if we try to bring sheriffs underneath that?
If a conflict of interest wouldn't necessarily involve a qualification for office, so long as if there's how would a conflict of interest be dealt with, and if it were to be, if one were to exist hypothetically, and a sheriff, if this were applying to sheriffs, were to refuse to acknowledge that and continue in that conduct, what would be kind of the teeth in enforcing of that? It'd have to be the same option available right now, which is either impeachment or voluntarily leaving office. Otherwise, any sort of attempt to remove them would get into that unconstitutional or area that's not permitted under the Constitution currently without amendment, having to do with qualification for office and removal from office.
So to make sure that we understand, so what you're saying is we could put all kinds of procedures in here about what a conflict of interest is, what is our desire as a General Assembly for the ethical behavior of a sheriff in this section as it relates to conflict of interest. But at the end of the line, if there's a complaint that results where, a member of the public or somebody who's maybe a deputy sheriff is involved in the office or whatever makes a complaint against the sheriff, the remedies for that are exactly the same. It's not as if there's some new remedy. It's really impeachment or resignation is the only way that
The ultimate remedy for noncompliance would remain the same.
Thanks.
Not seeing any other hands on that section.
The next part of the bill pertains to sheriff's contracts. And this is really two sections, Section 5 and 5A, which was added by the Appropriations Committee in the Senate. 5 will amend Title 24 VSA, Section 291A, title contracts, specifically subsection C, and adds a new subsection F. So I want to make a quick note here that this bill will actually amend subsection B as well, but this is really just to correct outdated terminology. It doesn't really have substantive effect on the law. This section, that is the contract section in Section 291A, really applies to all contracts to which sheriff's departments are a party, not only the municipal contracts. That was a point of confusion in some of the committees earlier, so I just want to flag that for folks now. Subsection C, as modified, would permit administrative overhead fees in sheriff's department's contracts, but would limit the use of such derived funds only for the cost of necessary departmental expenses not covered by the state or county funds. And these would include costs of vehicles, uniforms, equipment, training, and professional services. The new subsection F would require, let me just, I'm going to take a moment and scroll down here so I can, between the two. Let's see, and thank you for your patience. A new subsection F would require agreement or contract for sheriff's departments to provide law enforcement or security services to county and state courthouses. That would be subject to a single statewide contract for those services and in all county and state courthouses. And there's another section below, Section 7, which would codify this as one of the sheriff's duties. Pause there. Okay.
Can I just raise a flag on that?
Representative Murphy.
We ran into this problem several years ago in Windham County when the contract with the courthouse through state funding really didn't even cover the cost for the sheriff's department. So what happened is the sheriff withdrew from the contract and a rental security service was brought in, which presented its own challenges, one of which being they're not authorized to carry out the duties of law enforcement, and that's a problem in court. When you have sheriffs there who can, for instance, when I worked in child protection, there are times where children have to be brought into custody and only a law enforcement person can do that. So I just want to hold up the flag to make sure if we're going to do this, that we're putting enough money in there so it covers the costs of having sheriffs do the court.
I think what I'd like to do, because we have some other folks that we want to have testify, and I want to at least get through the initial overview. I think flags like that are really good at this point. I want to make sure we get through the overview and hear some things. We will be coming back to this bill at length. I just wanted to kind of get this initial stuff on the table. So I just want to make sure the committee kind of knows that we're not going to go too far down the rabbit hole on anything more today, because I do want to hear from some of our witnesses who are waiting after we get through the overview. So go ahead.
Section 5A is session law that will temporarily, as in calendar years 2023 and 24, will allow administrative overhead fees in those contracts referenced in the prior section to be used to supplement salary payments to a sheriff, not more than 50% of the annual compensation of sheriff, and providing that that sheriff has been in office at least 2 years. And then also would supplement salary of any employee of a sheriff department or a sheriff that has been in office less than 2 years. And that would go up to 10% of the annual compensation for that employer sheriff.
So that 2-year piece was the appropriations amendment? Okay. We'll dig on that later.
The next part of the bill pertains to sheriff's duties. And this is 3 sections, 6, 7, and 8. Section 6 will amend Title 24, VSA Section 293, titled Duties, adding 3 new subsections, B through D, and duties for sheriffs. B is a requirement that sheriffs maintain a record of their working schedules. C is a requirement that sheriff's departments comply with standard operating procedures manuals and policy manuals created by the Department of State's attorneys and sheriffs. And D will require the sheriff's departments to provide assistance to individuals with a relief from abuse order to retrieve personal belongings, and also do so without seeking a fee for such services. Section 7 will add a new subsection to Title 24 VSA Section 293E, requiring sheriffs to provide a minimum of 1 deputy sheriff certified as a law enforcement officer in accordance with Section 20 VSA 2358, and that was the section referenced above, for law enforcement and security service for each county and state courthouse. And this will have a later effective date. Just want to note that. And that is referencing Section 5 above.
Representative Hango has a question.
Thank you. Is that 1 deputy for the county and 1 deputy for the state courthouse, or is that 1 deputy for both functions?
I will have to look at the exact language. I don't know off the top of my head.
Thank you.
I believe the department may have a comment to make about this, how this particular section works. Go ahead, Tim, thanks.
The next section, Section 7 will add, Section 8 will amend Title 24 VSA, Section 299, which is titled Duties as a Peace Officer, modernize use of force terminology, bringing this into conformity with existing language in Title 20 VSA Chapter 151, which is the VCJC statutes. The next part of the bill will pertain to the repeal of penalty for refusal to assist a sheriff. Section 9 will repeal Title 24 VSA Section 301, which is a penalty for refusing to assist a sheriff. And sorry, there's an error here. There is Section 9. I forgot to delete that part. The next part of the bill pertains to Sheriff's Department's Oversight Task Force and Report. This is one section, Section 10. I provide a little bit more detail here just to it's presented in list form, which I found visually digestible. But the first part of note will be membership. I've listed 1 through 9 there. Happy to go through that if the chair would like, or I can just kind of skip that if you like.
I think we can skip that for the time being, and we'll dig into it.
And then I've also listed out in the outline the subject matter that the task force will be reviewing and including in the report. And there's 8 items there. I'm happy to go through those quickly, or we can skip those for now and kind of keep it at a higher level.
I think the committee can take a look at the nature of the report, and we'll dig into it when we do the line by line.
Well, then that leaves the last part of the bill, which is just the effective dates, Section 11. And let's see, all the provisions will take effect upon passage except Section 7, which is that requirement that a deputy sheriff be at each county and state courthouse. And that will take effect on July 1st, 2024.
Well, thank you, Tim. We will have you back for a deeper dive for some more of our introductory remarks. So we'll probably pick this back up next week.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Tim. All right. So I think next we have the auditor's office, and Deputy Auditor Ash is here. Thanks, Tim, for being with us today.
Sure thing. Good morning, everybody. Tim Ash, Deputy State Auditor, for the record. I feel like you've now had 2 walkthroughs of the whole bill, so I'm not going to go into too much great detail, but I just want to cut my presentation into 2 pieces. The elements that directly relate to the auditor's office are pretty straightforward and few in number, but based on some of the questions that committee members have asked so far, I'll provide at the beginning just a little context. So for several decades, the auditor's office has been charged by the legislature to perform biennial audits of each of the 14 sheriff's offices. So the threshold question, why is the auditor's office involved at all with the sheriff's departments? It's because the legislature directed us to perform financial audits. Senator Hardy mentioned that those are done by a firm that we contract with, McSorley McCoy. All those audits appear on our website under the local government section. And if anyone would like any specific links or anything, I'm happy to share those with you. So they're done on a schedule of roughly 7 each year. They're not picked out for any reason other than we have to get through all 14. As Senator Hardy mentioned, from time to time, the audits present interesting information that's out of the norm. Without getting into too much detail, some of it's been in the news, so it won't be surprising. In 2 of the most recent audits that were performed as part of our regular course of operations, one of them did produce the knowledge of about $400,000, slightly over, I believe, in bonus payments, and I can talk about that in a second. And then the second involved Franklin County, and in that case, the firm that does our contract work had to step back, and Auditor Hoffer directed some information to the law enforcement, statewide law enforcement, to take a look at potential financial misdeeds. Questions about what law enforcement is finding would better be directed to them. But that's the basic question about what is the purpose of these audits. It is to make sure that someone is keeping a close eye on what can be substantial amounts of money flowing. The provisions that directly relate to the auditor's office and requests that we made in working with the Senate committee are found in sections 2 and 3. Senator Hardy really did describe them in brief, but I'll just quickly explain what the basic premise is. And on your website, you'll see I provided an annotated document so that if you forget why we've asked for this language, you'll be able to go back with a plain English explanation. But in section 2, we're trying to address, better get at what we believe the original legislative intent was around the transition of an incumbent auditor incumbent sheriff who will no longer be in office. The current language is, the intent of the language in section 290, which you see in section 2, was really meant to have a little bit more scrutiny of expenditures of sheriffs who are known to be on their way out the door. It was a legislative action that required this, so presumably the legislature wanted to make sure that in the closing days of a sheriff's tenure, there wouldn't be any abnormal financial activity. The language you see really just makes it clear that from the moment that worry really kicks in, when a sheriff announces that he or she will not be staying in the position, that is the moment that the side judges are obligated to co-sign on checks and outgoing transactions. The existing language fell short of capturing that period of time when the legislature had expressed the most concerns. Section 3 makes 2 changes, proposes 2 changes. The first, as Senator Hardy mentioned, there was a case in Addison County, I shouldn't call it a case, but an instance where upon election, the sheriff in Addison County created a standalone nonprofit called Addison County Community Support. Information about it was fairly limited, but what was available on a Facebook page associated with it included mostly activities that one might normally associate with the sheriff's department itself. The stated intent was to draw money from municipalities and other entities to support those activities, and the directors of the organization were members of the sheriff department and included the same phone number and mailing address. So in many ways, it was it was almost indistinguishable from the normal sheriff's department. And so, as Senator Hardy mentioned, this merely requires that the auditor's office and the Department of State's attorneys and sheriffs be notified if such an organization is established, so that we don't find ourselves several years down the road and have something of a shadow sheriff's department with a shadow budget doing things and funding things that are meant to be held to public account through the normal channels. And then the change in section C at the bottom of section 3, your legislative council person didn't have it quite right, probably because he doesn't work in our office with the familiarity. But when a sheriff is leaving office, in practice, what that has resulted in is a requirement that we do another audit on top of the normal biennial audit. That audit is done for a 6-month window of time and is usually won't be ready until usually several months after the sheriff has left office. By changing the language, as you see in the bill, our attempt is to free ourselves from the requirement to do a full-blown second audit, which may be just months after we've done the normal audit, and allow us to go in and do a much quicker spot check, if you will, to make sure that in those closing hours of a sheriff's tenure, things are being done done properly. So this doesn't require any new action. What it does is just removes the requirement that we do a full-blown second audit. And the way it gets billed is no different than the normal system, which is the very modest charges get billed back to the department. There are a couple pieces that are sprinkled throughout that relate to work that came out of our office. One of which is in section 5A, and this is in part speaks to the question of the so-called 5% allowance. We did, at the request of the Senate committee, inquire of the auditing firm we contract with to better understand how much money was being taken as compensation by the sheriffs themselves that reflected monies beyond the normal salary amount. So this would include not just whatever portion of the 5% allowance a sheriff was choosing to take as salary supplement, but also any bonuses or other extra compensation amounts that were taken. We got information for 11 out of the 14 coming from their most recent audited financials. 3 of them were under $10,000 of additional compensation. 6 were ranged between 10 and 40,000, and 2 were in excess of 40,000. The reason we are not yet comfortable providing more specific is because we did ask the auditing firm to present this very quickly to us, and we don't want to articulate the numbers without a slightly higher level of confidence that they're accurate. But those ranges should tell you a little bit. And they relate to something that Senator Hardy indicated that the Appropriations Committee added on the Senate side, which was this 2-year allowance of up to 50% of salary, I believe, if I've got it right. So considering what sheriffs have actually been receiving as additional compensation, that 50% cap by our simple kind of back of the envelope calculation would actually enable all but 2 of the sheriffs for which we have information to receive more compensation than they'd actually been taking. So you'll have to talk with the department and the sheriffs about whether that is a provision which achieves whatever objective the committee is looking to do. And then the Section 10 report, the third sort of duty or issue area that is intended to be explored includes a variety of compensation topics, including bonuses. And on your website, I asked Andrea to post 2 memos, one which was directly from the auditor to your committee and your counterpart committee in the Senate, and the other is a memo from McSorley McCoy, the firm, that relates to the Caledonia instance that was discussed earlier. And the long and short of it is right now, the sheriff's accounting manual recommends that there be a policy around bonuses. And this gets, I think, to Representative Morgan's point earlier. In the instance of Caledonia, as Senator Hardy says, there was no allegation that anyone broke the law or anything like that, but they did not have a policy in place. And that's what makes the issuance of more than $400,000 in bonuses, I think, raise eyebrows, because it's hard to, it then requires a committee like yours to go back in time and say, Sheriff, what was the basis for it? Why were the amounts what they were? And the memo that's on your website includes the breakout of the 16 employees and the amounts that were paid in each instance. For some of the employees who had annual compensation from the Sheriff's Department, in that instance, they were when they were modest. Sometimes the bonuses actually exceeded what their annual compensation was. For others, it was merely a very significant number in the area of 10, 20,000 for some of the employees. So I have confidence that the sheriff could come in and explain why he made those allocations, but there was no policy directing it. And as a secondary issue, and this is why a policy is important, it reduced the cash balance of the Caledonia Sheriff's Department by about 50%. So whether or not it's the right judgment to make the bonuses is for others to opine about. But it did have the effect of leaving the next sheriff administering department with substantially less funds for which to make a number of decisions with. So I'll leave it there because I know you've already gotten a lot of detail about all the provisions in the bill, and I don't want to bore you with topics you might not be interested beyond what I've just said.
Well, I think you did a great job of summarizing some of the places where the auditor's office is really deeply embedded in this bill. Representative Hooper has a quick question, but I just wanted to thank you, Tim, and say that we'll probably ask for you or the auditor to come back and weigh in further as we dig into the bill a little bit more deeply next week. Representative Hooper, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hey, Tim. I'm confused by that last series of comments. I had assumed from what I had heard before that the distribution of the bonuses violated no statute because it came out of the 5%. The 5% sort of is a commission that the sheriff takes in running the business of the sheriff. Senator Hardy referred to that as public funds. I'm not sure it fits into that category. I'd like to know. And it seems like most of the money that you were just talking about is out of that 5% and is historically completely sheriff discretionary money. Why would that amount that was given to the employees give the next sheriff less to work with if the 5% were the previous sheriff's quote unquote skim money, whatever you want to call it, that should have gone with him, I would suppose?
Well, I guess I'd put it this way. The cash on hand for a sheriff's department accumulates over time, either a short period of time or a long period. It could have even predated some of those funds, the current sheriff. If a department, let's say, has $500,000 of cash available for discretionary uses, and the outgoing sheriff uses $400,000 of that to issue bonuses for whatever reason, that leaves $100,000 available, a substantially weaker position financially for the department. Now, the next sheriff.
Define that. Are you including, is the 5% included in that discretionary cash, or is that effectively income for the sheriff at the beginning and he decides what to do with it?
That's a good question. We would have to dive deeper into the constituent elements of that department's cash on hand, because of course, not all contracts include the 5%. Not all keep the 5% in the department. Some have done different splits. So it would be case by case for each sheriff's department. If we could drill down a little bit further or ask the firm we work with, who's got a little bit more detailed analysis.
I think that we will probably spend a lot of time talking about the discretion and levels of discretion over that 5% as we dig into the bill. Tim, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Yeah, if I can just save you the trouble perhaps of asking one question that that came up on the Senate side. Someone asked how long this 5% provision has been in place, because it comes up from time to time in legislative considerations, and the best we can track is 1991 was when that provision was first established. So it's been in place for quite a long time, and now it's for you to decide, what to do with it. But thank you, and yeah, I'm happy to come back at any point.
Representative Hango has a quick question before you head out.
Yeah, just a clarification, please. In 1991, when that was put into statute, was that because at that time the sheriffs agreed to it, this is my understanding, in lieu of a pay raise?
That's a question that when I was in high school, I wasn't paying as close attention to that particular matter. Interestingly, on the Senate committee, there is a former sheriff, Senator Norris, and those kinds of considerations were clearly had to have been in play, talking about total compensation. But the annotated statutes don't have that level of detail on the provision. It merely says that whole section was added then, and I do not believe it has been changed since 91.
Thank you.
All right, so we are going to hear from Sheriff Anderson, who's here with the association next, and then the department, and then we'll switch gears and take a short break in between and get started a little bit later than previously published on our return to H386. So Sheriff Anderson, thanks for coming back.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, members of the Committee on Government Operations, Military Affairs, Andrea, thank you for your time. For the record, I'm Windham County Sheriff Mark Anderson, and I'm here in my capacity as the president of the Vermont Sheriff's Association. A lot to say. Anyways, the Vermont Sheriff's Association approached this legislative session in agreement with reforms for sheriffs. When we define the word reforms, we're talking about improvement. For years, including from 1991, we have talked about this concept with sheriffs of being neither fish nor fowl. We don't belong to the state, but we kind of have a foot in the door. We don't belong to the county, but we kind of have a foot in the door. And we don't really belong to anything other than this weird quasi-governmental business thing. And so we do what we do. You'll hear that we're described as a business, and very much we are a business. I'll use COVID as an example. My business was decimated because we didn't have anyone to do work for. I had employees that I had employed, and that we all know the issues with the labor market right now. I had employees I had to consider either laying off or keeping employed. Now, that's not what you want to hear from a public safety provider, but that's what we were talking about because I was running out of runway. At one point, we had less than $10,000 in our bank account. At one point, when I said to the federal government, like, hey, can I apply for the payroll protection plan? I was told no, because you are a government entity. When I said, can the county pay for this? I was told no, they're not authorized to do that. And when I said, can I get, FEMA funds? Well, sure, but those might take some time. And I had $10,000 in the bank. So what do I do? The issues that have happened in the last 6 months generally deal with people who are no longer sheriffs. There's one, I know that there's one that is currently a sheriff, and there are issues. And I don't want to come here because we have issues within our ranks. We'd rather not have the issues. We want that solved. This is embarrassing as a professional to have people accused of sexual assault, to have people accused of assaulting a person in our custody. It is embarrassing to have allegations that we are stealing money from the department. That is embarrassing. And so I am very passionate about improvements to the sheriffs, which are meaningful. I can talk at length and ad nauseum on many of these things. I know that we are short on time today, and I know that there will be other opportunities to do that. And I'm happy to come in and work on things that mean improvement. Right now, the Sheriff's Association does not support this bill. It was well intended. It does not solve the issues that we were coming into the session to solve. What it does do is hurt us. It potentially shifts the burden of the gaps that we fill onto the state of Vermont or onto our communities, because it fundamentally breaks the way that we contract. Right now, there's a provision within, we'll talk about the contract provision very briefly. There's a provision which might mean I can spend $50,000 a year for every $1 million in contracts I raise for overhead. My retirement contribution is $156,000 in 2022. So I can't even pay retirement, which is an overhead cost. If I can't do that, I can't employ people. If I can't employ people, I don't have contracts. If I don't have contracts, I'm not providing service. We want change. There are many provisions of this bill that do not provide meaningful reform. There are some sections the auditor talked, or the deputy auditor talked about improvements. We're fine with that. We're open to transparency. In fact, you can read in the newspaper, various media about the 5% over the years and how that's used. And we can look at other law enforcement agency executives and what they're paid. When we're talking about employing deputies or dispatchers or other civilian clerks, we're falling far behind the other organizations in the state that we have to compete with. And so when we're told we need to provide a deputy to every courthouse, but the amount of money we're given to do it is half of what agencies in a jurisdiction are paying, we're struggling. When some sheriffs don't offer retirement, healthcare, or any other benefit, and their way to retain personnel is to provide a bonus, they do that because there's no guarantee a contract will be there next year. Generally speaking, in our labor pool, deputies are going to leave to go to another agency if the pay is higher. That's fairly straightforward. I think that's accurate in most places. A lot of deputies do believe in the mission of what we do, which is where we're fortunate to retain, but we also see them leave to go to higher paying jobs. This is not a new problem in Vermont. We have seen it all over the place. So right now, we oppose S-17. We want to get to a place where we can solve the issues that we came to solve. I'm happy to answer questions, but I also know you have other witnesses.
So what I would say is I'm going to hold my questions. I'm happy to have a couple of folks on the committee ask questions at this point. What I would ask you to do, if you haven't already, is if you could put in writing the specific suggestions you have for us to consider, that would be very helpful. So Representative Hooper and then Representative Morgan.
Sheriff, how many points of contention have you with this bill currently?
So we just received it as passed by the Senate. So I think roughly seven, but I want to make sure that that's an accurate number. We were working in agreement with the judiciary on how to provide deputies to the court, but there is this funding issue that we need to solve.
Can you foresee this thing shaping up into something you would support?
Potentially.
Representative Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got a multitude of questions and I know we're limited on time, so I'm hoping we can have Sheriff Anderson back.
Yes.
Because I think he's a plethora of knowledge from the short bit of experience I think we've had as a committee and could shed a lot of light on a lot of things before we collectively go down this rabbit hole of this bill as it stands. But just a couple of quick ones, maybe Sheriff, if you could, speaking of that, I asked Senator Hardy the same thing. I don't know if you heard me ask you the question on that, the bonuses, and I'm not trying to get you to out another former sheriff or anything, but do you have any input? Because I've heard anecdotal stuff as I was whispering to Representative Hooper here earlier. Do you have any firsthand knowledge of any method to that madness, because it is a whole bunch of money, I gotta admit. But is there the realm of possibility that from your perspective, that was justified and made sense?
So I don't have it firsthand, and we are working on getting a memo from the current Caledonia County Sheriff to provide the firsthand information to this committee. However, talking to the Caledonia Sheriff, so I hope you will accept me paraphrasing to a degree, they don't offer healthcare. They don't offer retirement. Through COVID, they were concerned that they wouldn't have the funds to continue operating, much like I almost ran out of funds. And so they didn't provide pay raises. They didn't provide any bonuses. They didn't provide anything. They kept it all within. So for 2 years, the personnel who stuck it with the department, the outgoing sheriff said, I'm going to give you a bonus that accomplishes these prior 2 years that you got nothing. When we talk about $400,000, that is a lot of money on the surface. When we look around what other agencies in the state are currently doing, the state police just asked for $500,000 for recruiting and retention. Burlington PD is paying $850,000 for recruiting and retention. There's roughly 20 different organizations offering bonuses from undisclosed amounts. Not to say that there's anything nefarious about the amount, it's just not posted on their advertisements, up to $15,000 or $20,000. We're competing to hire with that.
Yeah, I can shed some light on, because as a selectman in my town, we just had to recently work with our police agency to look at that because it's a real, there is a, I don't know, I would just say there is extreme competition for the limited number of people willing to step up and be law enforcement officers today. That's a real concern in this state, and people should be taking notice of that if they aren't. And if we aren't, we're remiss. So I hear you spot on. And the one I'll just leave with on this is that I guess I'll use the words, I take kind of umbrage with the fact that the term systemic problems, I hear what you say loud and clear. I think it's the 10-90 rule that we're hearing. 10% ruin it for the other 90. You have it in every organization, every entity on the face of this planet. And I get concerned when I hear a group that I think Sheriff Anderson is trying to head up professionally being whacked with a bat, I guess, a bit. Maybe I'm being a little harsh by saying that, but it seems like that's a little harsh and a little unfair at this point.
Representative Morgan, we will have a lot of time to talk about this bill.
Yeah.
Right now, we have witnesses waiting. So
yeah, I'm just passionate about law enforcement, and I don't want to see us lose this entity that I think performs a great service where it's lacking in this rural state.
Okay, we are way, way behind. So Representative Hooper and then Representative Chase, briefly as possible.
Real quick one. You mentioned retirement and healthcare. Is there a difference in that category between the sheriff himself, the state deputies, and the non-deputies, the non-state deputies?
There is quite a bit of disparity. So as I would disagree. I'm a state employee. I'm an independently elected official, as each of you are, but my salary is paid by the state. My health care is paid by the state. I am in Group F of the state retirement system, which is a 30-year retirement system. All other state law enforcement officers are in Group C, which is a 20-year retirement, but as a mandatory out, so sheriffs are not eligible for it. I didn't make the rules. The state deputies are in Group C. They are in a mandatory out. They are getting the state health care. And then my department deputies, in the case of my department, in roughly 7 or 8 departments throughout the state, our deputies were placed into the state retirement system, which is still a 30-year retirement. They are not subject to the mandatory out, but we also cannot leave the state retirement, which I'm finding incredibly unaffordable, but I'm required to stay in it. So these 8 departments, and this has worked before the General Assembly in years past, was to allow our deputies to be able to join the 20-year municipal retirement system. We've been working with the Treasurer's Office, the General Assembly, to do that work so that we are also on a level playing field for hiring our personnel, acknowledging as sheriffs, we are also on a level playing field for ourselves, but we go into that knowingly.
Thank you. Representative Chase.
You mentioned 800 for Burlington and 500 for state police. Do you have a per capita or per head count comparison to the 400?
So the 400 was roughly 16 employees. Burlington is 56 employees. State Police is, I think they're at 275 employees. Some agencies are as small as 8 people. Some agencies are as large as 30 to 40 people. So the reason I raise the dollar amounts is to say that often what we're finding is the number sounds big as you divide it across the people. If you look at it per person, it's somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000 that the person was given. Thank you.
Sheriff Anderson, thank you. Sorry that things got crunched. No problem. And here we're just beginning our work on this bill, so I will be inviting you back probably next Wednesday. I think is how things are shaping up if you're available. So
I will make sure I'm available. Thank you for your time.
So I did want to hear brief remarks from before we break on this from the department. So Director Campbell is here along with Operations Manager Noonan. So thank you for both of you being here and listening in. So would love to hear your initial take and maybe help guide our future conversations on S17.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and folks. First of all, I promise we're going to make it very quick because we'll give that overview. And I know that we will be back. In fact, I've asked the speaker to make me an ad hoc member. I retire as a senator and a representative. So.
Dangerous to have the former pro tem in your room.
I'll tell you really just quickly, because I know we're going to be discussing this, in the weeks to come. But first of all, I think the Senate took on a tough topic, and it was about accountability of our sheriffs, and there has to be accountability by the sheriffs and by anybody who's in a position of authority. We are as government officials. I think we should be held to a higher standard than what exists in other, maybe private organizations. With that said, I think the mission that they set out on, and Senator Hardy had established what they've done, and they really did a lot of work. I mean, it's not an easy topic, but I think it needs to be focused, and I think we need to figure out exactly how we can get the accountability. And I also look to see that it's, what the accountability is for. We have these organizations, these sheriff's departments, which are part private, part governmental, part quasi-governmental hybrids. And it's really tough to figure out who can tell what to do and what they can do and what funds can be available. I know that one of my concerns, and I think probably one of the sheriff's concerns, is that in this bill, they require the sheriffs to do a lot of work in different places, locales like the courthouses, doing RFAs, and also doing transports, which there's only a limited number of people out there, and they only have a limited number of folks to actually do these things. So it worries me that if this passes the way it is without actually looking at the numbers and figuring out where we have the resources to do it, it's going to set it all up for failure. The courts are going to be calling and saying, wait a second, you guys told us you're going to give us, you're supposed to give us sheriffs and deputies. Where are they? Don't have them because they're transporting prisoners or they're here or there. So that's why I think that if we take a closer look, and I think you all have more time than the Senate, and then this is not a knock on them at all. It's just the fact that, as I said, this is a big lift here. And I think that there are certainly some things that could be suggestions that we may have in the next week that would help out. We've been researching and trying to figure out some of the constitutional challenges since being in the Senate. And so I think we may have some workarounds that could be viable. And I'm going to leave it at that because I know these folks will need to testify or something. Oh, yeah. I need to tell you.
Well, I really appreciate the offer, Director Campbell, for you to work with us and to explore a little bit. One thing I did want to get on the table while you're here this morning at the beginning of this conversation was, for the committee, what is really the role right now of your department as it relates to sheriffs? Because I think it's pretty limited and people might not understand it.
It really is, and I appreciate that question. Actually, I should have said at the beginning is, folks think that because it says Department of State Attorney and Sheriffs, it means the entire Sheriff's Department, which is not. All we are in charge of is the state transport deputies, which are the 25 state deputies, and the sheriff's salaries get filtered through our office. So we basically administer their salaries and the benefits that they receive. We don't do that for the non-state deputies. We have no control over the non-state deputies. We have no control over actually the individual policies of the sheriff's department unless they deal with the state paid deputies. So, and I guess just in the end, and just in closing, if I could say, there's a black mark on the sheriffs right now in the state, and deservedly so for some of the individuals, for some of the actions that they did. But as some of you folks have already said today, I think it would be not only wrong, but I think we would be doing a disservice to the state if we just all of a sudden labeled them all bad and the whole organization, the whole systemic issue as being a problem. I think that they've sort of been, excuse the term, but almost a bastard child of law enforcement here. And the way they've been able to kind of stay alive is by these contracts. And I think if you look back at historically as to when they did that 5%, you'll see that's one of the reasons why they did it, because there was the state was not going to put it in the general fund budget to pay for the sheriff's departments and the individual things. So it's sort of forcing them to go out and chase these contracts, which personally, as a former law enforcement officer, I don't like mixing private business with law enforcement. I think it would be different. I was a sheriff down in Fort Lauderdale in Broward County, which is a totally different situation. Ours is more like the state police. But we did have a strong county government. And so you had that oversight. You had them dealing with everything. We don't have that. And as Senator Hardy said, and I really believe, and I agree with her, is that I doubt we'd be able to really create that county form of government right now. I'm not sure if we would want to.
Yeah, no. I mean, most counties that have county government have the population of our state.
Yes. Yeah. My brother was mayor of Coral Springs, which was like, it had something like 3 or 4 million people, so like larger than the state.
Representative Hooper, go ahead.
Thank you, John. Good to see you again.
Thanks.
At one point this morning, I wrote a little note that said, get a rope and find a tree, which is inappropriate. The one thing that you left out of your list is you also have no control over the 5%.
That's correct.
Those contracts.
That's correct. But we are trying to do one thing just to try to help out here, to find out, to talk with the prior sheriff to find out exactly the explanation of the $400,000. I believe from what I've heard, but it's just anecdotal hearsay, is that it was to exactly as Mark had set out with to repay people for healthcare, for and retirement, and for what they did during the last 3 years when they were not paid. So I can't say that for sure, but so and happy to come back at any time. And if any of you all have any questions outside of the committee hearing, please feel free to give us a call, myself or Andy Noonan. We're happy to help, because I think this is a problem that needs to be fixed in order to give a little more confidence, bring back confidence in a major part of Vermont state government.
You have specific suggestions, as I asked Sheriff Anderson, we would be very happy to sort of get the perspective and writing from the department.
Absolutely.
We're looking at how we can maybe make some improvements on S-17 as it came over to us. Representative Higley.
Real quick, one of the things I just heard you say, and I want clarification. You said under those bonuses, the past 3 years, is it?
I believe it was since the pandemic. There was the sheriff had been there. He's been there for quite some time, and I know that they were having problems with trying to retain people, keeping them over there. But we only had, I believe, one. We had one state deputy there. The rest of them were private deputies, and I think they did, and I think they also did law enforcement duties in Caledonia. So
Okay, so 20 to 22.
yes, and I'll get specifics for you on that, because it is something I think that should be cleared up.
All right, so we're going to take a break on this and take a break from the committee, and then we'll come back to something completely different on the Brattleboro Charter Change Bill. So I would like the committee to try